quickly closed, I watched him, breathing heavily all the time. Then, making no more noise than a cat, he moved away across the deck, and I could judge of his height by the fact that his small swathed head remained visible almost to the time that he passed to the end of the white boat which swung opposite my stateroom. In a moment I slipped quietly to the floor, crossed, and peered out of the porthole, so that at last I had a clear view of the sinister mummy man. He was crouching under the bow of the boat, and attaching to the white rails below a contrivance of a kind with which I was not entirely unfamiliar. This was a thin ladder of silken rope, having bamboo rungs, with two metal hooks for attaching it to any suitable object. The one thus engaged was, as Karamaneh had declared, almost superhumanly thin. His loins were swathed in a sort of linen garment, and his head so bound about, turban fashion, that only his gleaming eyes remained visible. The bare limbs and body were of a dusky yellow color, and at sight of him I experienced a sudden nausea. My pistol was in my cabin trunk, and to have found it in the dark without making a good deal of noise would have been impossible. Doubting how I should act, I stood watching the man with the swathed head whilst he threw the end of the ladder over the side, crept past the bow of the boat, and swung his gaunt body over the rail, exhibiting the agility of an ape. One quick glance fore and aft he gave, and then began to swarm down the ladder, in which instant I knew his mission. With a choking cry which forced itself unwilled from my lips, I tore at the door, threw it open, and sprang across the deck. Plans I had none, and since I carried no instrument wherewith to sever the ladder, the murderer might indeed have carried out his design for all that I could have done to prevent him, were it not that another took a hand in the game. At the moment that the mummy man, his head now on a level with the deck, perceived me, he stopped dead. Coincident with his stopping, the crack of a pistol shot sounded from immediately beyond the boat. Uttering a sort of sobbing sound, the creature fell, then clutched with straining yellow fingers at the rails, and seemingly by dint of great effort, swarmed along aft some 20 feet with incredible swiftness and agility, and clambered onto the deck. A second shot cracked sharply, and a voice God! I was mad cried, "Hold him, Petrie!" Rigid with fearful astonishment I stood, as out from the boat above me leaped a figure attired solely in shirt and trousers. The newcomer leaped away in the wake of the mummy man, who had vanished around the corner by the smoke room. Over his shoulder he cried back at me: "The Bishop's stateroom! See that no one enters!" I clutched at my head, which seemed to be fiery hot. I realized in my own person the sensation of one who knows himself mad. For the man who pursued the mummy was Nayland Smith! I stood in the Bishop's stateroom, Nayland Smith, his gaunt face wet with perspiration, beside me, handling certain odd-looking objects which littered the place, and lay about amid the discarded garments of the absent cleric. "Pneumatic pads!" he snapped. The man was a walking air cushion. He gingerly fingered two strange rubber appliances "for distending the cheeks," he muttered, dropping them disgustedly on the floor. His hands and wrists betrayed him, Petrie. He wore his cuff unusually long, but he could not entirely hide his bony wrists. To have watched him, whilst remaining himself unseen, was next to impossible. Hence my device of tossing a dummy overboard, calculated to float for less than 10 minutes. It actually floated nearly 15, as a matter of fact, and I had some horrible moments. "Smith," I said, "how could you submit me..." He clapped his hands on my shoulders. "My dear old chap, there was no other way, believe me. From that boat I could see right into his stateroom, but once in I dare not leave it, except late at night, stealthily. The second spotted me one night, and I thought the game was up, but evidently he didn't report it." "But you might have confided..." "Impossible. I'll admit I nearly fell to the temptation that first night, for I could see into your room as well as into his." He slapped me boisterously on the back, but his gray eyes were suspiciously moist. "Dear old Petrie, thank God for our friends. But you'd be the first to admit, old man, that you're a dead rotten actor. Your portrayal of grief for the loss of a valued chum would not have convinced a soul on board." Therefore I made use of Stacey, whose callous attitude was less remarkable. "Gad, Petrie, I nearly bagged our man the first night. The elaborate plan, Marconi message to get you out of the way, and so forth, had miscarried, and he knew the porthole trick would be useless once we got into the open sea. He took a big chance. He discarded his clerical guise and peeped into your room, you remember? But you were awake. I made no move when he slipped back to his own cabin. I wanted to take him red-handed. Have you any idea who he is? No more than where he is. Probably some creature of Dr. Fu-Manchu, specially chosen for the purpose. Obviously a man of culture, and probably of Thug ancestry. I hit him in the shoulder, but even then he ran like a hare. We've searched the ship without result. He may have gone overboard and chanced the swim to shore." We stepped out onto the deck. Around us was that unforgettable scene, Port Said by night. The ship was barely moving through the glassy water now. Smith took my arm, and we walked forward. Above us was the mighty peace of Egypt's sky, ablaze with splendor. Around and about us moved the unique turmoil of the clearing house of the Near East. "I would give much to know the real identity of the Bishop of Damascus," muttered Smith. He stopped abruptly, snapping his teeth together and grasping my arm as in a vise. Hard upon his words had followed the rattling clangor as the great anchor was let go, but horribly intermingled with the metallic roar there came to us such a fearful, inarticulate shrieking as to chill one's heart. The anchor plunged into the water of the harbor, the shrieking ceased. Smith turned to me, and his face was tragic in the light of the arc lamp swung hard by. "We shall never know," he whispered. "God forgive him. He must be in bloody tatters now, Petrie. The poor fool was hiding in the chain locker." A little hand stole into mine. I turned quickly. Karamaneh stood beside me. I placed my arm about her shoulders, drawing her close, and I blush to relate that all else was forgotten. For a moment, heedless of the fearful turmoil forward, Nayland Smith stood looking at us. Then he turned, with his rare smile, and walked aft. "Perhaps you're right, Petrie," he said. End of Chapter 33. Recording by Elaine Tweddle, Stirling, Ontario. End of The Return of Dr. Fu Manchu by Sax Rohmer.